Thank you. That's a very difficult presentation to follow. I'll just be very frank with that. So, but I think we will resonate on some points that may be useful. So I was asked to deal with this topic that federal agencies require research data. So I transferred that into a question that I thought was relevant for the session. And the main question then that I'm trying to address is, how is industry-funded research used by federal agencies? And I will try to give you some examples that, again, I think will resonate with what you've heard from Dr. Sharma. So just in terms of my disclosures, my current employment is USAID. I have no money at USAID, so not a conflict. Previously, I worked at the Food and Drug Administration, the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition, as well as the University of California, Davis. I don't have research funding. I do serve on some advisory boards, and I'm also a member of one of the WHO subcommittees, the subcommittee that looks at diet and risk of non-communicable diseases. Now, what I want to point out from my disclosures that's relevant to my presentation is I'm going to speak from my experience at FDA, on the food side of FDA. So there's so many ways that federal agencies use research information. And when I first started thinking about that, I figured there's no way I can handle the full scope. And I think you'll hear more from Esther about some of the ways that federal agencies use research data. So I'm going to just speak from my experience working at FDA, and hopefully that gives you some insight on how federal agencies can use a variety of different resources. So the two areas then to give you examples from in terms of work that the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition is involved with is the safety evaluation of ingredients, food additives, and evidence to support claims that are products, which is more in line with the office that I was director of at FDA. And again, I suppose if I'm following the Sharma model, I'd say I think FDA has a pretty good process, so that's my bias, and I think it's important to understand that process. So if we look just what are the sources of information that are useful to federal agencies, these include reports from authoritative scientific bodies. The National Academy of Sciences are the classic example of an authoritative scientific body. Also, the consensus reports that are produced by other government agencies. It's usually a good idea to have the government speak with one voice when possible, especially when making recommendations to the public. But of course, the agency looks at experimental studies that are published in the peer-reviewed literature. For some of the work that the agency does, it may not be published research. It may have a proprietary interest, so it's submitted to the agency as part of a packet, but it's not in the public peer-reviewed research. And then, of course, there is research conducted by federal agencies that is used directly by those agencies. Probably the most familiar example is NHANES, that the data gathered in NHANES is very useful in decision making. And if you look at the decision making around updating nutrition facts, NHANES figures prominently. Also, several of the federal agencies have their own consumer research group. FDA has to do that because we have to understand when certain things might be misleading to consumers and to use that kind of information. So in general, the nature of agency review in these two areas that I'm going to give you examples from, safety and claims, they require submission of all the evidence. So it's not the good, you submit the good, the bad, the ugly. You can't just submit the good. You have to submit all of the evidence. That the agency does provide guidance on how it will review and evaluate scientific data. So it makes it very public the way it's going to look at that information. So anybody can do that kind of evaluation for themselves if they follow the same procedures. And I think this is the area that often people may not understand. The agency does in fact do an independent review, and they're focused on the methods and results. You can kind of throw away the discussion section sometimes. You focus on the methods and results. And so people say, well, FDA hasn't researched something. No, they haven't done laboratory research, but they do their own independent review. They don't just accept the conclusions from the published literature. And often the goal is, and we'll talk about this more with health claims, they're trying to determine if the evidence is useful for making a scientific conclusion, which is then based on the quality and relevance of the data, not the funding source. And I got a few nasty letters at FDA when we said we could not use a particular study to draw a conclusion. And of course, the author of that paper was upset, but there were good reasons why we couldn't necessarily use the study. So first, just to comment on safety, and again, this is what my colleagues at FDA did, but I want to be sure that we touched on safety. So from the statute, FDA does have authority to look at food additive petitions that can be approved for adding something to the food supply. It has a statutory requirement, meaning it's in the law, what it needs to look at, and you can see the items listed here: identity of the additive, proposed use, technical effect, method of analysis, and then full reports on all of the safety investigations. And what's important to understand about the nature of this information, most scientists aren't going to just produce that kind of information on their own. It's someone who has a stake in having that additive approved for use in the food supply. So it's likely to be the industry or research that is funded by the industry. It's not the kind of research that, say, NIH would necessarily support. And you see also that bottom line that it has to be all safety investigations. And again, FDA does provide guidance for food additives. It's the Red Book, which is on the website, in terms of how it will go through its own independent review of that information to determine safety, to determine an acceptable level of use of the product, or to deny the petition, to say, no, we're not going to approve that use. So now I want to shift and talk a little bit about the evidence to support claims on products. And I'm going to focus most of my comments on this first area, the claims that are based on petitions to the Food and Drug Administration. These are health claims, including qualified health claims. There's also a notification process where, again, the agency has to look at the science and make some comment or approval, not approval of the submission. There's also the whole arena of claims that are based on truthful and not misleading. And substantiation of these claims are based on the manufacturer's responsibility. FDA has provided guidance. It makes it very clear what kinds of evidence it believes will substantiate those claims. But if there is to be a gap anywhere that we need to think about, how do we build trust in terms of consumer perception of claims that are on food products, it is probably this area, the claims that are based on where it's the manufacturer's responsibility. But I'm not going to comment further on that. So FDA has, once again, published a guidance document. This is available on the website. It was finalized in January 2009, and it outlines its evidence-based review system to evaluate health claims. And it doesn't matter whether it's one of the authorized health claims based on significant scientific agreement or a qualified health claim, which may be a fairly low level of evidence. It goes through the data in exactly the same way. And so what I've put on this slide is an overall schematic of how FDA goes through that process. It starts with all the studies and publications. So again, it's the manufacturer's responsibility to submit a full packet, and FDA won't file the petition unless a full packet is in fact submitted. It then goes through several steps to determine what studies are not useful to review or draw a scientific conclusion from. So it now has a body of evidence that it can look at and go through a process of evaluating the quality of the science. So first I want to talk a bit about what studies are not useful. So what FDA has indicated is what it regards as suitable for review are human studies that actually evaluate the substance-disease relationship. That's going to be a part of the claim. It's not all the studies out there, but it has to actually evaluate that relationship. These can be intervention studies. It also considers observation or epidemiological studies. There's a long list of things that it does not regard as suitable for review. Review articles, meta-analysis. It can look at a meta-analysis, but most meta-analysis just simply do not provide enough data for FDA to do its own independent review, that generally they're not useful. Book chapters, abstracts, animal studies, in vitro studies, and studies that do not pertain to the substance or disease. And believe me, they get submitted. So right away, we've made a major cut in terms of what is useful. And this then just lists the examples of fatal flaws that FDA identifies in some of the human studies that are submitted, some of which may be surprising to you, but trust me, they're there. There's no control in the study. It lacks relevant statistics. Often the most common example of lacking relevant statistics is rather than compare a treatment and control, it's compared baseline to endpoint. So it's not a relevant comparison. And it's not FDA's job to do the right statistics. Key confounders are not controlled. A non-validated biomarker is used as the endpoint, so it's not a surrogate endpoint of disease. There's not an independent effect that you can determine from the study design. The classic is you want to make a claim about lycopene, but all the studies were in tomatoes. There's observational data without any intake validation. The study was conducted in a malnourished population, and in most cases that means that malnourishment is not relevant to the US population for which the claim would be used. Or it's a disease population, and when a study is done in a disease population, often the nature of the study is mitigation and treatment. It's not lowering your risk for getting the disease. So I'll go back quickly to this slide. So once that review is done, do I have a, I don't know if so we're at that blue circle, the second blue circle, the evidence that is useful for evaluating, oh, is that it? That FDA has the evidence. Now it has to figure out, is there in fact credible evidence for a claim? Keep in mind that some studies will show benefit, some studies will show no benefit. There's also an evaluation of the quality of the evidence. If the only data is low quality evidence, FDA would have a hard time moving forward with a claim. And then once you have that body of evidence, you can decide, is it a good level claim, is it a qualified claim, and do you need to deny it? So again, the nature of the agency review is there has to be all the evidence, the guidance, it gives you guidance on how it's going to look at the data. It conducts its own independent review that focuses on the methods and the results, not on the conclusions that are drawn within the scientific paper to get to that point of making that determination. And I think, once again, if you think about most of the research that will be done to support a health claim, if you think of that spectrum of research from very basic into more application of the basic science and to the point of implementation and actually using it, who is likely to do the funding along that spectrum of research? We hope that our federal agencies are funding the more basic and initial phases of application, but when we're at the point of figuring out, does oat bran lower plasma cholesterol, that's most likely to come from industry-funded research because they have that direct application. And if you look at those fatal flaws that I gave you, the funding source is not considered as one of the fatal flaws. It's the nature of the evidence, the quality of the science that is produced. So if I come back to my main question and look sort of how do we move forward, what do we need to think about? From my own experience working at FDA, I think having clear criteria for how we review the scientific evidence is an essential part of being able to develop something where we can have trust, that we all know what those criteria are and we all understand how any one of us could apply those criteria. I would say one of the greatest frustrations when you're in this process of doing these kind of reviews is, as we heard from Dr. Sharma, the implication, the derive is to find that great difference, to look at that great discovery. And from a regulatory point of view, I would love to see more evidence where you tried, you did the right experimental design, but you didn't see a difference. Those studies too often stay in the desk drawer. They don't get out into the peer-reviewed literature. And if we had a way that we can get the full body of research out there so we know when there's a benefit and we know when there's no longer a benefit, it would be very useful. I would just add, as a final comment, with the WHO committee that I'm on, it uses a process to look at scientific evidence referred to as GRADE, and very similar in terms of looking at the science independently so that a body of experts can evaluate the strength of the science and then determine how it can be used to make recommendations. And while they ask the question about funding source, the evaluation always comes back to the quality and relevance of the data. So with that.
Thank you very much.